Episode 3 The Final Curtain. Good evening. I'd like to tell you about my strange experience at the cinema that I used to work at. My name's Josh, and this is my story that happened a few years ago, around 2004. I was fresh out of university at the time, now full-time at the local cinema, whilst I got around to applying for a proper job. The cinema itself was owned by a standard national chain and unremarkable in most respects. I'm sure you've all been to one that's similar. It was located next to a run-down business park and had also been declining in popularity for some time. It was built in the 1970s but remodelled several times. There was certainly room for improvement. The carpets were in fairly poor condition, there was peeling paint, and altogether it was very much a no-frills experience. Just to give you some background on the scale of the building, it had 9 screens, each of which held 100 to 200 seats each. At the point that my story gets strange, I'd already worked there for months, so I was very used to the people and the building. I'll try to tell this story to the best of my recollection with as many details as I can. Typically, you turn up for your shift using the front entrance the same as everyone else, walk through the lobby, through a small corridor, and then into the staff room. There wasn't much to it, just a simple room with some lockers where you could put your kit whilst you're on shift. There was also the obligatory notice board and photos of all the staff, and also the employee of the month. The way the staff typically worked was in teams, so you had the front desk ticket sellers, the food and drink cashiers, and the floor staff. At this point in time, I was the team leader of the floor staff. By this point, I'd worked there for some time and I knew the place inside and out, and let's be honest, I was really overqualified for a front of house job. Despite the low pay, it's actually rather fun to work in a cinema. There's lots of running around, tidying up, and interactions with the customers. And of course you get to see the movies for free, so all in all, not a bad gig. As I had just finished university, I was keen for any shift and extra money, and often filled in for the lates. I actually enjoyed the late shifts as they were quite relaxing. Once that last film had started rolling, there really wasn't that much more to do other than hang around and tidy up a little bit. The general regulation was that there needed to be 2 staff on at all times, and this was mainly for safety purposes. In the daytime, a cinema can become a really busy place. You can have over 1,000 people in the building at any one time. However, on the late shifts, there was very much a contrast. You'd be lucky sometimes if there were just 5 people watching movies. Despite this, I was actually very comfortable with night shifts. I enjoyed the quiet and the magic of the theatre. But one night shift, something very strange happened to me, and I still can't really explain it. That night I was doing front of house duties downstairs, and the only other colleague in on the floor was a girl called Sarah. Upstairs there was a projectionist called James, and he would often leave before the last film ended. This was perfectly safe to do so. He often just asked me to go up there and check and power things down at the end of the night. Basically, on this type of shift, all you really did was tidy up and lock up. I remember that shift really well. There was just one late midnight showing, and that was due to end at 3 AM. What's more, there were only 2 couples in to see the movie. Now this work situation might seem a bit isolated if you're not used to it, but remember, we were really quite used to doing this day in, day out, so it didn't bother us at all. It was relatively safe as most cinemas have CCTV, we also had 2-way radios on us, and we were also allowed our mobile phones with us on the night shifts. With the 2 couples now watching the movie, it was time to go through the evening's procedures. And this consisted mostly of tidying up and making sure everything was ready for the morning shift. It's worth saying that you do often hear noises in cinemas at night time. So imagine the big cavernous area of a cinema at night time. There's only the small lights on, and we've powered down. With all the dropped popcorn, it's no wonder our cinema had mice in it. And no, we weren't a badly kept cinema. This is actually quite common of most cinemas and public places. With all of the people gone and now on your own, you could often hear the mice chewing on the popcorn and kind of running around. It was actually quite nice because, there was life in the cinema. I'd often see them, particularly around the bins at the back, but only at night time. In the daytime, I think they just hibernated. You'd also hear other noises in the cinema that you wouldn't be used to unless you worked specifically in a cinema. Again, I'd often be in the theatres on my own in the dark, and naturally any sound you're listening out for. Of course, the mice would keep you company, but there would be other noises. Some of the creepier noises have to be the valves and subwoofers that are set up in each of the auditoriums. The huge subwoofers can actually retain their charge for quite some time, so when they dissipate they actually make a noise, which is quite creepy. Sometimes you can get kind of a small boom noise, but other times it's more of a kind of murmur. It's really quite creepy, but not so creepy if you know what it is. There's other elements of the auditoriums that are also on an automatic timer, so things like the curtains will also swing back after a certain amount of time, and you never notice this if you are actually just going to watch a movie. However, after hours in the dark, the sound that a squeaking curtain can make can be quite creepy. Over a few months though, you got to know all of the ambient sounds, the squeakings, the booms and squawks that happen in a cinema after dark. It's all absolutely normal and nothing paranormal. On those late nights, you'd often find yourself inventing games, such as trying to limbo under the kitchen area, or just trying to guess how many hot dogs were left. Really, it was anything you could do just for those few hours to pass the time. We always paid quite close attention as to how many people were in that last showing, as we didn't want to lock them in overnight and find someone sleeping there in the morning. Perhaps it's also worth mentioning at this point that I played rugby at university, so I'm a fairly large chap and I'd like to think that I could handle myself. I at least look the part. I went round each of the screens, making sure that the torches were all back in their cupboards and that the walkie-talkies were back on their charging rack. I used to go to each screen in order, and of course I ended up in screen 9. And this is where things get a bit creepy. So I was in screen 9, and I swear I saw a shadow across the screen from the projection room, and this shouldn't actually be possible. The reason? Well, James the projectionist had already left, and I know this for sure because I saw him leave, and besides, his car wasn't in the car park. I did also check later in the office, as we do have to sign in and out for each shift. Sure enough, he had signed out when I knew he had. Now, I really don't think that I had imagined the shadow on screen 9. The only plausible explanation I could think of was light bleed from one of the other screens. So light bleeds when one of the screens opposite has a particularly bright flash of light. This light can travel through the projection area and out the other side into the cinema opposite. In this case it would have been screen 9. So I investigated the screen opposite, which was screen 2 by our numbering system. I went in, looked around, but it was as expected, completely empty. The movie in that theatre had actually ended over 4 hours ago. Just as an additional check, I went next door into screen 3 and the same story. I looked around, there was nothing in the darkness, not even mice on this occasion. And that's when I stepped back out into the lobby to find a young man waiting for me. He was one half of one of the couples that were watching the movie in screen 5. He was very matter of fact and just came to let us know that it looked like the reel had fallen off in screen 5. Thankfully he was pretty decent about it, and although he must have been annoyed, he handled it rather well. Of course, as front of house I said I would go up and put that on straight away and check what was happening. Now in this era it's actually very uncommon for reels to fall off of their platters. So as a bit of insider knowledge, whenever you see movies on TV, the reels are always held vertically, but this is not actually the case in cinemas. Reels of film are actually held on large platters, so it actually looks like a reel sitting on a large metal plate. This actually makes it very difficult for them to slip or fall off, so it was a little surprising to have this complaint. It never actually happened to me up until this point. So just in the corridor off from the staff room, there's a very narrow staircase that leads up to the projection booth. The projection booth actually runs the length of the cinema. They're not individual rooms like they were once upon a time. To be honest, I wasn't very technical, but I was able to go up to the projector and understand that it was working perfectly. James had shown me previously how it all worked. Not to go into too much detail, but there are a series of clips that keep the reels in place, and to be honest, these looked untouched, and the reel was moving as expected, the light was on, and I could see no issues at all. Just as a double check, I looked through the window and the film was projecting correctly. Whatever it was perhaps an issue with the reel itself. Perhaps there were some dark cells or, who knows, some kind of minor issue with the bulbs. It was at this point that I radioed down to Sarah, who had been waiting in the lobby and at the door of screen 5. She confirmed that the movie was now playing absolutely correctly. Finally, the movie ended just after 3 AM when it was scheduled, and the two couples left. Now, I remember this very, very distinctly, as it's always good to know how many people are in your cinema after hours. The last thing you want to do is lock people in a cinema overnight and find them sleeping there in the morning. With all the customers now gone, it was just myself and Sarah in the lobby. We decided to divide and conquer and sign off each screen one at a time. While Sarah went to the screens on the left, I took the ones on the right of the lobby. I knew we'd already locked up earlier, so this was more of a formality than anything before we would lock up, set the alarm and lock the very front door for the last time. So you can imagine my surprise as I was entering screen 9. I was almost knocked over by a man. It was one of those awkward encounters where, two people almost walk into each other but they stop at the last moment. I jumped quite a bit as I hadn't been expecting anyone there, but he was more apologetic than anything. He was an older gentleman, and I can only assume that I'd missed him when I looked in screen 9 earlier. Perhaps he'd even fallen asleep somewhere between the chairs. He didn't say much, but I do remember what he did say. He said, "Just caught the last reel. Have a good evening." And with that, he turned and left. I went into screen 9 just to make sure the doors were really locked and he hadn't snuck in, and also just to give the place another once-over. Everything looked safe and sound, so I met up with Sarah back in the lobby. Of course, I told her about the jump I'd just had as this old man suddenly appeared on me. Strangely, Sarah had said that she hadn't seen him leave, although she could have been still tidying the screens at this point. Before locking up, we did call out if anyone was there, but there was no response, so we were free to lock the doors and leave for some well-earned sleep. I was actually on shift that next day at the cinema in the afternoon. As was the procedure, I did call into the office at the start of my shift to explain the issue that happened last night, that being that screen 5 went off for a short amount of time. If there are any outages, we are obliged to write this up in the incident book and have this reviewed by the projectionist. I got chatting to my manager, who asked me if anything else happened on shift last night, and I explained no, it was just a regular shift. It did then come to mind the incident of the old man that had made me jump as we were locking up. I told the story to my manager and she seemed concerned. I said really it was nothing, he must have been sleeping in there and we just missed him on the earlier checks. These things do happen. Not usually, but they do happen. But she seemed really interested and she asked me to describe him, so of course I did. Since he had scared me the night before, I remembered his appearance quite well. He was a relatively short man, I'd say perhaps in his 80s, with quite a kind smiley face. He certainly wasn't scary to my eyes. That's when my manager asked, "Did he tell you what his name was?" And of course I explained, well no, it was only a fleeting moment, there was no need to exchange names. She just had this look on her though that something wasn't right, and of course I pressed her. I said, "Is there something wrong?" So that's when she started going through the drawers in the office, and eventually she pulled out a piece of paper and looked at it before handing it to me. To my surprise, it was a photo of the old man. Of course I was really taken back. This was 100% him, and this was actually a staff photo. You could tell by the uniform that he was wearing. Of course I said, "Oh okay, he works for us, I've never met him, who is he?" I assumed that he was perhaps one of the maintenance team that work behind the scenes sometimes. But that's when my manager said, "No, that's Eddie. Eddie used to work with us, but he passed away over a year ago." I really thought she was winding me up. I just couldn't believe it. This was 100% the man that nearly knocked into me. I asked her to describe him, and to my surprise, she described him very much as I would have. He was slightly smaller than average, and he was a very smiley, happy person that loved the movies. I asked her how she was so sure and how had she so quickly gone to the conclusion that this was Eddie. And that's when she told me I hadn't been the first person to see him. He wasn't a common occurrence, but apparently every now and again someone on the night shift reports seeing him. Of course my manager had no proof, but she seemed very settled on the idea. She wasn't really the type to joke around with this type of stuff. Her reasoning was that Eddie had come back to the cinema as this was one of his happy places. Apparently he had spent many hours in the cinema after his shifts just enjoying the movies. You know, all part of the experience. He really lived the cinema. She even went as far as saying that it might have been Eddie that helped fix the fault in Screen 5. He'd been known as a talented mechanic on the side, so anything is possible. And these stories had come from several people. Perhaps Eddie really was still looking after the cinema that he loved so much in life. Did I see a ghost? I really have no idea, but I really have no explanation. The photo of Eddie really was the man that I saw, and that's no mistake. Like most people, I thought that if I did ever see a ghost that I would be scared, but that really wasn't my experience at all. I guess if you don't know they're ghosts, they're not so scary. After that date, I never saw Eddie again, but I wouldn't mind if I did.
If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.